thank you very much. It's quite a hard act to follow what's gone before. So I'm going to change the tone a little bit. And what I really wanted to do in terms of presenting this is to talk a little bit about the future, but really from the standpoint of being able to step back a little bit from the daily work that we do, whether we're practitioners or researchers, to ask some searching questions which will hopefully inform what drives us forward in our respective roles. Forget this. So, whither goest thou, the Romans used to say, quo vadis. Here we have Peter Ustinov or Nick Alderman, they're starting to look increasingly like one another these days, standing outside a building which looks suspiciously like the Kemsley unit. Yeah. So it's laden with symbolism, this slide. And what we have is really an opportunity to reflect from Roger's talk on what neurobehavioural rehabilitation has brought us to date. So based on what we've learned from Roger, the very innovative approach that began in the late 70s at St Andrew's Hospital, the Kemsley Division, or unit as it was, has really had quite a wide-ranging impact, not just on neurobehavioural rehabilitation, but much broader to other subspecialties of rehabilitation. The idea, for example, of taking rather than a simple syndrome approach, taking a more functional analysis. The idea that behaviour disturbance must be seen not as situational rather than as an inherent, stable dispositional characteristic of individuals. The need to, and Hughes talked about this as well, formulation rather than diagnosis is the way forward. The fact that treatment can't simply be related to medication and drugs, yes, they still have their place, but as Roger described, for many people, in order to actually engage in the learning process that underpins rehabilitation, we want to minimise any use of drugs. So treatment focused on learning methods was innovative. The emphasis of a trans or sometimes an interdisciplinary working model has been key, and I think it's become core across a lot of different aspects of rehabilitation now, but it started in the innovative work that Roger described. And recognition that as an educational, as a learning process, rehabilitation is fundamentally underpinned by a psychological enterprise rather than perhaps a more narrow medical approach to treatment. Recognising that when we're dealing with people who have brain injuries of various sorts, whether it's acquired brain injury or developmental, essentially we have to start with the organic basis to the behaviour disorder and work from there. And then particularly those of us who are trained in psychology, there's been a huge and very important shift in terms of looking at behaviour, what people do, rather than simply how they fill in a questionnaire or how they perform on tests. So these are all important achievements that have been that have happened to date, which I think is very important for us to acknowledge the significant contribution of neurobehavioural rehabilitation. We also know that there's been a lot more emphasis now that rehabilitation is both clinically but also cost effective. So this was the situation 25 years ago, when there really wasn't a lot of evidence to support some of our endeavours. And just a few years later, Lynn Turner-Stokes and other people too have noted that there's increasing evidence that, as I say, that this is a cost-efficient method of intervention. And the statistics we've heard from Hugh just really illustrate and bring into sharp focus the terrible costs, human costs, financial costs, societal costs, when these things are not treated and addressed. So what I wanted to do is, as I said, step back a little bit and say, well, look into the future. What kind of neurobehavioural rehabilitation do we want? What should be our aims? Now, there's some of the techniques that worked very well when Roger was practicing, and even when I think back to when I joined the field, we probably wouldn't be allowed or we wouldn't wish to do these days. And those techniques, I'm not going to mention any particularly, but those techniques might have been very effective, but we wouldn't feel comfortable pursuing those strategies now, which indicates that really our choice of what's an appropriate method isn't simply guided by what's effective, but by other considerations. Now, in future, of course, as we progress neurobehavioural services, we're going to be influenced by advances in understanding the brain, particularly neuroplasticity, how the brain responds to experience. Advances in technology will also impact on how we practice. But the key thing that I want to emphasise in this talk is, what do we do with that knowledge? How should we use it? Yeah, should we merely be driven by advances and do things because it's possible to do, or should we stand back a little bit and think more carefully? So what should be our aims? By what means should we strive to achieve them? And also importantly, I think, and something that doesn't tend to get talked about at this type of conference, what values should we uphold in so doing? So those are just that give you a sort of a framework for why this talk is perhaps a little bit different from some of the things that you'll be heard today, but hopefully somewhat complementary. We know that the conceptual origins of neurobehavioural rehab are in a behavioural social learning theories, particularly an operant learning, whereas Roger said it was the therapeutic value of reinforcement, particularly positive reinforcements, that underpinned many different learning techniques and strategies that were so innovative in their day. Peter Eames, some years ago now, talked about when developing a rehabilitation service and getting the right culture, the staff embracing a general atmosphere of positivity and adopting a slightly over-effusive social demeanour in order really that the contingencies of positive reinforcement could be most salient. Now, you can see what's coming next probably, but when I walk into a rehabilitation unit today, a general atmosphere of positivity is probably not the first thing that tends to strike me. Yeah? And for some people, they've lost that sense of the glue that fits it all together. You may have all the qualifications, all the experiences with your own discipline, but where's that kind of glue that fits it all together? That trans or interdisciplinary working, that's critical. And I think to some extent there's a danger as we become more and more specialist of losing that kind of work. So I wanted to emphasise that because it's something from the past that we need to carry forward through the present and into the future. Social cognitive, that used to be called social learning theories, tend to be latterly referred to as social cognitive theories, were also very important. And I've just illustrated one, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of self-efficacy. So this is the idea that it's expectations of reinforcement can determine how much effort and persistence that people will demonstrate or put into achieving an objective. In other words, if you don't think that it's within your capability, if you don't feel that it's within the realm of your competence, then why on earth are you going to bother? So what this means is it's not simply the objective reinforcement contingencies that can be set up within a system, but it's important to also consider the extent to which that individual believes or feels that they've got control over their environment and is able to achieve those rewards. So what it follows is we can improve learning by enhancing self-efficacy. I realise that this isn't going to stretch. Does that look at that? Well, that's good, isn't it? I can do it over there, but I can't quite. Can I? I can't get that one. Never mind. We'll stick with this one. So you can improve learning by enhancing self-efficacy because you can give people a greater awareness and understanding of their ability to achieve these goals. And this is very important when we come to setting goals in terms of whose goals are they. So sometimes when I do goal setting workshops, we spend quite a lot of time not talking about goal attainment scaling initially or SMART goals, but just initially, just the concept of goals. What is a goal? What does it mean? Do we have goals in our own life? How comfortable are we in people setting goals for us? What does it feel like if someone were to set our goals for us rather than allowing us to set our own objectives? Clearly there needs to be some kind of compromise. Sometimes people, perhaps because of lack of insight or perhaps because we're not comfortable with the kind of goals they might choose, we're not willing to go along wholeheartedly with those goals. But equally, we probably know that if we try and impose goals and objectives on people, it's a sure way to ensure that they will not only fail to comply, but they may deliberately try and sabotage or undermine them. So I always said I might possibly do some kind of slightly Marxist analysis in my retirement of rehabilitation as a recapitulation of the class struggle. But we'll move on from that for now. Self-instruction. Now, self-instruction is something which has a long history dating back at least to the 1960s and Don Meichenbaum and others. But I think it's very important to understand, and I don't think Roger did say, but I wondered if he might say, that one of the influences on the practice of neurobehavioural rehabilitation, really from its origins, was the importance of understanding the role of language in regulating behaviour. And this can be dated back to Luria, and who's influenced by Vygotsky and so on. And the frontal lobes in particular, which have a role in language production and generating creative thought and language, that often, after serious brain injury, is impaired and undermined. So people lose the ability to bring language back into the fold and use it to regulate their behaviour. Just one extreme example I'll give you, but it was striking. I had a case some time ago of a lady who was had severe encephalitis, and one of the things I asked her to do, I can't for the life of me remember why now, was to stick her arms up in the air and bring them down by her side again, and up and down. It's not a standard neuropsychological assessment tool. And then I asked her to stop quickly before anyone came in, I think, and she couldn't. She would do this, and she was perseverating on this, and I said, "Have you stopped?" And she'd say, "Yes." And I said, "Oh, I don't think you have stopped. Could you stop?" He says, "I will do." And of course, this carried on until we then said, "Okay, up, down, down." And once she'd kind of got that link between the verbal prompt, she was able then to regain control of this really rather simple but perseverative behaviour. And that again struck me as really quite a powerful demonstration of how, if you get it right, you can recruit language in the service of behaviour. And that is something I say which has long been a key feature of neurobehavioural rehabilitation, but I think that people often perhaps don't fully appreciate the importance of it and how to use it. I'd encourage you to read some of Lurie's early works, The Working Brain and the Higher Cortical Functions in Man that was produced. And I'm still working through my copy as we speak. It's quite dense, but it's certainly good sometimes to go back to the old masters and to the original texts, really. It's food for thought. So I think self-instruction is something which is really important that we need to acknowledge. We think perhaps we're a bit more sophisticated at that now because we do CBT. Well, we'll come on to that shortly, but let me just re-emphasise the importance that particularly for people who are very severely impaired, who might not be amenable to some more sophisticated verbally mediated interventions, you can still use verbal mediation very effectively. And this has been perhaps developed by Mark Ilversacker, who's sadly no longer with us, and others, to look at positive supports for behavioural change. And he's done a lot of work in looking at adolescents who have difficulty engaging within learning environments and in sometimes youth custody and so on. Let me just take that one step further. Along with verbal regulation, that's one of a number of tools that are important when we think about self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is something that's so basic to everything that we do that we often don't think of it. And I think it underpins pretty much most of what we do in our daily lives and consequently in the way in which we work as practitioners. And thirdly, it underpins so much of what we are trying to do with the people we serve in a neurobehavioural rehabilitation service. So self-regulation is really, really important. And that's probably, I'm not going to say, I may finish this talk a little sooner, I may finish it slightly later, we'll see. Someone's going to hand, is it you, Nick, who's going to wave at me when we get closer? Okay, that'd be great. So self-regulation has a long history. Yeah, I don't really recognise these characters. So Adam and Eve, in Paradise Lost, Milton refers to Eve's rash hand in evil hour as she takes the apple, and of course she offers it to Adam. You go first, son. And then in that case, of course, we all know what happened, and we're all here as a result. Another case here, I don't recognise this one. This is Odysseus, who wanted to listen to the siren calls and stuff the ears of his men with wax, but he wanted to be free to listen to these wondrous calls he'd heard so much about, and had ordered his men to strap him to the mast of his ship, quite why he had to be naked at the same time. I'll leave you to come to your own conclusions. But in fact, my wife saw this and said, well, how come it's always the women who are tempting the men, and it's the men who have to demonstrate their self-control? But I think it was ever thus to some extent. The point is that self-regulation, in one form or another, once you start looking for it, you see it throughout history and mythology. Now, here's a nice man, nice friendly man, with a marshmallow. This is a man that does things with marshmallows. I don't know how many people here are familiar with this chap. Anybody recognise him? Yeah, one or two. Okay, from a sort of person I might have had nightmares about as a child, I think. So this chap is one of the foremost personality theorists from the 1960s, Walter Mischel, and he developed a very nice, simple test. And I was thinking about this when I was listening to your stuff about offenders, because it's interesting to look back at this test. So you don't just have to do it for those who are interested in doing this at home. It doesn't have to be marshmallows. Okay, you can use other treats are available. But he had as a scenario where a child would sit at a desk and was shown a marshmallow on a plate in front of them, and the adult would then leave the room for 5 minutes or whatever. Before they did so, the child was told that if they waited for the adult to return to the room in a couple of minutes, then they could eat the marshmallow, and in fact they could have an extra one too. Okay, so you get a reward for delaying the sort of gratification. But there was a bell that they could use to ring at any time, and the adult would return to the room if they wanted to eat the marshmallow, but they weren't allowed to eat it until the adult had returned to the room. So if they felt they needed to, they'd have to ring the bell first. And if the child rang the bell or started to eat the sweet or got up off the chair, then again they would forfeit the second marshmallow. Okay, the second treat would be gone. So those were the rules in effect. And so what you get then is this, what's now become quite famous, and it has many different guises. There was a study done in Cardiff actually, I think last year, looking at a similar sort of thing. So there's your marshmallows, and a little child sits in front of the table staring at this marshmallow in an otherwise fairly plain and unreinforcing, unrewarding room. And as time goes on, he starts to, you can smell it, it starts to permeate him, and you can see him breathing out there, can't you? It seems to be going on. He's thinking, when's this person coming back, for goodness sake, And it becomes harder and harder, and we're only talking, perhaps 5 minutes at the most. That's a hell of a long time to a small child faced with a marshmallow. And you could really, really despair, and then in the end, you just, what can you do? It's incredibly difficult to maintain self-control, but some kids can do it better than others. Some adults as well, I must admit. But what they found, because these early studies were done in the 60s and 70s, they've been able to follow these individuals up, those who were delayed for quite a long time before they succumbed, and those who were a bit more impulsive. And what they found, that the kids who were preschoolers, who managed to delay gratification, as adolescents were less distractible, tended to be less disruptive, on the whole were more confident and self-reliant. This is over and above all sorts of other factors that may or may not have happened to them during the intervening 10, 15 years. And as adults, when they were followed up further to the 80s and 90s, higher self-worth, lower BMI, perhaps not surprisingly, they can resist those marshmallows. More importantly, perhaps better able to cope with frustration and stress. And also there appeared to be some differences in patterns of activation when they were looked at in scanners, which is also quite interesting in terms of possibly dispositional or maybe genetic factors associated with that. So, okay, some people are just, perhaps better disposed than others, but the key thing is, can we train that? Can we make a difference to those individuals who perhaps did succumb? Can we identify people at 4 and 5 years of age who are a little impulsive, who don't delay gratification? And so what we found out is that children waited longer if they were primed to think happy thoughts beforehand to distract them. If they only saw a photograph of the marshmallow rather than the actual object itself, or if they saw the real sweet but they imagined it as a picture. And they waited less time if they were primed to think about the sweet whilst they were waiting, or were reminded how tasty it is. So if the Confederate went out and said, you think about that lovely, sweet, tasty marshmallow, how nice that's going to be when I come back, then they waited less time. And this really taps into this notion of hot and cold thinking that's so important as we move forward in understanding now how we can use advances in cognitive neuroscience to understand how better to treat people who perhaps characteristics show these different dispositions. So if you focused on the appetitive qualities of a stimulus, not surprisingly, that meant that people were very focused and they found it very difficult to resist temptation. Whereas if you looked at the more cognitive, non-affective, non-emotional characteristics, that you've just got a thick white square in front of you, children could be taught to focus on those attributes of the stimulus, and not surprisingly, they tended to wait longer. Now, that's a long way from perhaps avoiding people getting into trouble or trying to rehabilitate them after a brain injury, but the same principles apply. So this difference between hot and cold thinking, and the fact is that it's not simply fixed in stone from birth, it can be influenced by adverse experience, but also by positive experience. So we know that there are various different bits of the brain according to a number of different experimental tasks here that were done on the Cambridge gambling task in scanners. And you'll see that there's quite a bit of similarity, particularly around the frontal area. Same areas seem to be involved in a number of these sort of tasks which require self-regulation. And if we think about how certainly traumatic brain injury arises, I've oriented this, you can see, to be on the sort of same orientation as that. Again, you can see these orbitofrontal regions being particularly, and inferior temporal here, being particularly susceptible. So it's not surprising that whatever characteristics people have before they have the accidents, and we know about the socio-demographics and some of the lifestyle behaviours that predispose people to being at higher risk of head injury, in addition they have this double whammy because they often have these kind of problems as well. So from a philosophical point of view, it got me thinking about Stoicism, because what we're really talking about, being a bit more stoical, being able to deny ourselves more. And then I thought about this. This is a story that I part learned when I was at school, and then later on I sort of caught up with the other half of the story. This place, I don't know if anybody recognise it, this is Plas Newydd on Anglesey, the home of, Hugh's nodding there, the home of the visited, yeah, the home of the Marquis of Anglesey. And there he is, the first Marquis. He was, there's a story that I heard that he was at the Battle of Waterloo, there we go, depiction, and he was on his horse, astride his horse next to the Duke of Wellington, and some cannon exploded nearby. And when the smoke had cleared and the noise had died down, he looked down and he said to the Duke on his side, "Good God, sir, I've lost my leg." And the Duke looked and said, "Great Scott, man, so you have." And it had gone. No one knows. History doesn't record what happened to the leg. And I often wondered what had happened to the Marquis. And it turned out that he did live, and he became the recipient of what's believed to be the world's first articulated wooden leg, as opposed to a traditional sort of piglet. This is it's not the same Marquis. This is the latter day Marquis with said leg. So I had quite an interesting story, really, a sort of typical sort of phlegmatic stoicism in the English, and in this case the Welsh upper classes, although having said that, he might even be English. I don't know. So that got me thinking about, is there something that we can think of that informs the way psychological therapy works and neurobehavioural rehabilitation, which typically hasn't really embraced philosophy that much, that we can use that to drive it forward, because we do need to step back as things become more advanced, more sophisticated. We're in danger of just following trends, and I think it's very important that, yes, of course, we need to take advantage of what's available, but we also need to do so with some clear ideas of what it is that we're doing and where we're going. So one of the key influences in early Stoic philosophy is Epictetus, who was quite an influence. This is one of his many quotes: "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them." And Marcus Aurelius, played by Richard Harris in Gladiator, for those that, yeah. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realise this and you will find strength." So you can see how that many of the ideas that are current in different forms of different schools of psychological therapy can be traced back to this sort of approach. There's Socrates, whose method of disputation formed a number of key principles that underlie CBT and others. That's Epictetus, and there's Marcus Aurelius, looking nothing like Richard Harris at all, really. And then just for good measure, there's Seneca. I was going to put Aristotle in, but he's not really within this group, and Roger's already mentioned him. Here we are, the original Mr. Kipling. If we think about his poem If, yeah, recite it with me. Think about if you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. Yeah? How stoic is that? Yes, there's a lesson for us all, I think. So this is a guide for life as much as a guide for therapy. And one of the things that I think is important, if something is worth putting into neurobehavioural rehabilitation, it's worth considering, does it just simply belong within that, those narrow professional parameters, or is it something that actually has broader applicability? And vice versa, if something has broad applicability for life generally, well then surely it's worth considering whether or not that has a role in our professional practices as therapists, as practitioners, as rehabilitation specialists. So I see the two things as very much bound together. Albert Ellis, Marcus Aurelius again, not Richard Harris, Albert Ellis, founder of what used to be called rational emotive therapy, and from the early 90s, I think, about 1992, it started to be called rational emotive behaviour therapy. His school in the 1950s of RET very much embodied it. This is my favourite Marcus Aurelius quote. I'm sad enough to have a favourite. Remove the judgment and you have removed the thought, I am hurt. Remove the thought, I am hurt, and the hurt itself is removed. So Marcus Aurelius wrote these meditations. They were never intended for publication. He did this on his Germanic conquests, during which he died as well. They were very much self-reflective. Possibly the first recorded thought diary. That's what we think. So Albert Ellis credited Epictetus with being a major influence on his notion, but also we can think back to Socratic methods of questioning, his idea of disputing, a disputational method of challenging rational thoughts. But the two things that I want to emphasise, it's an action-oriented psychotherapy, and it very much has a focus on the present. So when we think about some of the more sophisticated, we might think that some old behavioural methods are old hat, and we're more sophisticated these days, and we have cognitive behavioural therapy, isn't it marvellous? Certainly for some of the more, it has its place, but for certainly some of the more challenging, the more severely impaired people, a number of the demands that cognitive behavioural therapy makes make it very difficult for clients with brain injury to engage. And if you have all of these problems, then you're pretty much a poor candidate for a traditional CBT approach. So I think that's important to bear in mind. I'm not saying it has no relevance whatsoever, but it certainly is not going to replace a more traditional neurobehavioural rehabilitation. I'm just fiddling around trying to get my phone to work. I have no idea what the time is. And just a couple of other things. These experiments were from the 60s. Benjamin Liebey's famous experiments where he asked people to lift a finger, nice simple experiments like all the best ones are, but he asked the subject to tell the experimenter when he was going to do it. And what happens is he then recorded the scalp electrical activity from the scalp. And what you see here is this is the point at which the subject says, I'm going to lift my finger now, and here's the action. But this is the point at which physiologically the action begins to take place. And what that suggests is the contents of our consciousness are not necessarily a reliable indicator of what's really going on in our mind. Lisbeth and Wilson, social psychologists, they did a good study. We're unaware of what influences our behaviour, unaware how we've modified it, unaware of one thing causing the other. So the implications of this is any psychological constructs that we want to use to make things more cognitive and more fashionable must complement but not contradict basic behavioural principles. In an interesting, admittedly somewhat controversial, interesting study of CBT approaches, Longmore and Worrell some years ago now said there's little empirical support for cognitive changes as being causal. What's key is this notion of behaviour activation. If you want to change the way people do things, then you've got to, not surprisingly, focus on changing the way your behaviour is. And here's Chris Bruin's model, Professor of Clinical Psychology and Therapy, as a kind of competition between retrieval of memories or representations of action. You've got positive and negative. In a pre-therapy state, it's the negative ones that predominate. In a post-therapy state, you re-emphasise the positive ones that were there in the first place, as well as introducing some new ones. And that's his notion. And in so doing, by emphasising these, the negative ones are reciprocally inhibited. So that leads us on to thinking, well, perhaps what we need to do in neurobehavioural rehab is be a lot more positive, and perhaps positive psychology is the answer. This notion, there's the Greek for those amongst you, eudaimonia, is roughly translated not simply as happiness, but as more general well-being, and I like the term flourishing. And I think one of the things that we should be thinking about if we step back from neurobehavioural rehabilitation is, yes, we want to attract this target behaviour, this symptom, whatever, but ultimately, we want people to thrive within the parameters and their capabilities. We want people to flourish, don't we? And Socrates associated that with the virtues, one of which was self-control. So this fits very nicely. But so far, the evidence is rather limited. John Evans, who's sitting there, waiting for me to finish, commented that these ideas could be very relevant to brain injury in future. And there's an interesting little study, a pilot study, trying to use these methods with challenging behaviour after brain injury that anecdotally seem to work quite nicely with some people within limits. But so far, the feasibility study that John and colleagues with Cullen did in Glasgow really just emphasises the need that there's got a lot more work to be done before we can say that this is really something that could make a difference. But watch this space, because I think there's certainly something to be said for it. However, despite its intuitive appeal, there's a lot more to be done. There's possibly a neurological basis to this. This is an interesting study at Queen's Square, of all places, where they suggested that aspects of the insular cortex on both sides may be related to our feelings of well-being. Bing Crosby, remember him? Yeah, perhaps that's the answer. Accentuate the positive. That's what we need to do. Remember Bing Crosby and one of don't mess with Mr. In Between. Yeah, but let me just draw a caution, which my wife would be very happy for me to do. Let's think about the benefits of negative thinking as well. And this is the sort of thing I want to say as I get towards my last 3 minutes or so. Negative thinking shouldn't be underestimated. Okay, it's very important. Negative thinking. It has an evolutionary adaptation. It's the caveman who thought the saber-toothed tiger was probably going to eat him rather than the one that thought he was probably, just wanted to be friends, who survived. So, there's something to be said for the negative thinking. So take that, Mr. Crosby, with your endlessly positive crooning. So perhaps what we should do is accentuate the negative. Focus on things that might go wrong actually leads to preventative measures. This notion of chronic unease is what they try and involve people in doing in safety-critical industries, where you're constantly on the looking out for things that might go wrong, because it's kind of constructive pessimism. If you become aware that things might go wrong, then you'll be more engaged to do something about it. So it's an action-oriented approach. Just very quickly, this is very important. Typically, clients attach value to the outcome in risky behaviour, while clinicians focus on the likelihood of a negative event occurring. And what we need to do is get a balance between the two. This is the positive, this is the negative, and we need to kind of embrace both. So very quickly towards the end, focusing on what can be done to change a situation really focuses on our ability to change a behaviour. Again, it's what we can do in the here and now. It's the focus on the present. We come back to Epictetus, men are not disturbed by things, but the view they take of them. If we take a slightly more negative view about things, that actually doesn't mean we fall into despondency and despair, but it engages us to change things. So we see this now in psychological therapies are actually coming full circle and becoming increasingly behaviourally focused, which I think has an awful lot to be said for, if you like, joining the circle and making neurobehavioural rehabilitation even more applicable than perhaps people might have thought. So obviously we've talked about this one, it's somewhat old hat now. ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, uses this concept here of creative hopelessness. And again, it's not about woe is me, there's nothing I can do. It's about what I'm trying to do at the moment to address this problem in my life, the way I engage with my partner, the way I'm trying to deal with my symptoms. It doesn't work. So therefore, I need to change. I need to do something different. And I think that's very important. And again, like mindfulness, the emphasis is very much on the present. What can I do today? Never mind about the past. Don't worry about the future. Let's focus. So, 2 slides. In terms of the future then, the absence of an operant framework in the past to cognitive therapies has previously been criticised as promoting some kind of unhelpful form of dualism. Do they need a behavioural approach, or should we go more cognitive? As if it was a choice between one and the other. Increasingly, we've seen psychologically based therapies as behavioural in nature. And now we have a more radical post-Skinnerian analysis of relations between language and cognition, which has always underpinned neurobehavioural rehabilitation, which has belatedly come to inform more cognitive-oriented therapies as well. So again, we get this coalescing of different approaches. So that provides us with, and this is the last slide, a philosophical grounding for neurobehavioural rehabilitation as we take it forward now to meet the increasing challenges with technology and brain science. So we've got a framework for integrating cognitive neuroscience and technology with the more philosophically derived notions of self in context. And that lends itself both to the positive and the negative aspects of psychology, in other words, the more eudynamic and this kind of constructive pessimism constructs, which befits increasing focus that we're putting on competencies rather than simply deficiencies. But it also fits the current evidence that primarily what we're concerned about is not changing thoughts, but activating behaviour patterns. As Roger said, it's changing behaviour so that it becomes habitual, promoting effective change and learning. And I think he would have approved. Okay, so thank you very much.